Thank you, Betty. Thanks, Kathy. Thanks, Donna, back there. Thanks to all of you for having me. I am going to try really hard to speak in a positive way today. So I'm sort of starting with what I think is a statement about where we need to be going. And if you flip through my book at all, this is the way I end. But we have trade-offs to talk about today. And Betty mentioned one of them. That's going to be the main focus of my talk. But it's going to be important to kind of think through, as I'm going through this, what are the sorts of things you think we should be spending taxpayer dollars on, as I'm making a case, at least the first few minutes of my conversation with you, about some of the really harmful things that we may be having to spend some taxpayer dollars on pretty soon. It's all about trade-offs. And you know, you've heard statements like "to govern is to choose." We're going to be talking about a lot about choice today. I'm sort of a wanderer, so I am going to try to stay here within the frame of Donna's camera, but I do want to get out in front of the podium, if that's all right with you. Hope I don't make you seasick. You've heard the phrase "to govern is to choose." You've heard the phrase "budgets are moral documents." You've heard conversations about where we spend our money reflects our values. And I want to sort of keep that in the back of our heads today as we're talking about this stuff. Because all of this is a decision that folks are making and that we ultimately have to make too. I come out of a policy background, public policy background. All of public policy is about the choices you make with dollars, public dollars. So before I get to that part of the conversation, I want to kind of just tell you a little bit about myself, because as I have been all over the country, I have learned that just sometimes sort of having a conversation about where we're beginning and where we're going and what we're trying to say and what we're not trying to say has been really, really useful. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of that traveling. Honestly, I'm not going to give you a whole travel log, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been up to. First, this is a picture of me on my confirmation day. Those of you grew up in Catholic church as I did. Why am I starting this way? I'm a Christian man. A lot of what I'm going to have to say, at least in the first part of this conversation, is going to be talking about sending taxpayer dollars to religious schools. No one's beaten up on religion here, at least not me. I sing in a choir over at All Saints when I have time. This is really important to me. And whenever I go and talk about the use of taxpayer dollars on religious schools, what the other side will say, the Heritage Foundation, a bunch of Betsy Ross super PACs, they've gone through my personnel files, they've read a bunch of my emails at MSU, because they don't want you to hear the story that I have to tell you today, or the story that I've told all over the country. And one of the things they like to say is, well, all these folks, whether it's Josh, whether it's the Democrats, whether it's whoever, they don't like people of faith. That nothing could be further from the truth. So we're having a conversation about what to do with taxpayer dollars. I want to tell you a couple other things about myself too. I have 3 children of my own and a couple of bonus boys. All 3 of my kids went to public schools. First 2 have already graduated from Williamston. And one is still there. He's a sophomore, just finishing sophomore year. And a couple of other guys here at home with me right now in 2nd and in 4th grade. Big age gap, but I love them all. I started my career, so I grew up in Chelsea, not that far from here, if you know where Chelsea is. Forgive me, but I went to school at the University of Michigan. I feel like I'm legitimately allowed to cheer for both U of M and MSU because I went to University of Michigan as a student, and MSU gave me my dream job. So forgive the divided loyalties. After I graduated, though, 25 years ago, I went to DC, like a lot of people do. And I went and worked for the CNN show Crossfire, where I was a young producer there. And I haven't talked a lot about that, but I wrote a piece a couple of years ago when Tucker Carlson, who I worked for, one of the guys I worked for, got himself fired from Fox News, who was our rival when I was there. I think they still are. So I didn't necessarily start down the road of the kinds of things I'm here to talk to you about. I went and worked in the news environment, political environment for a long time. When I went to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin, 20 plus years ago now, 22 years ago is when I started, I immediately was assigned to work as a young data analyst on a state-mandated evaluation of Wisconsin's voucher system there, which was the first in the country. And that's sort of how I got my start in asking questions about vouchers. I was not necessarily there to do it, but this is what I was hired to do and trained to do, was ask questions about voucher programs. Who are they working for? Are they working at all? How are we using these dollars? If they're not working, why aren't they working? And so on and so forth. And those are the questions that I started to ask myself about lots of education policy programs over the next decade. But I started asking those questions as a young trainee and then a lead data analyst on a long-term project, and I always did it in partnership with state government. And I wrote early on about some of the stuff we were finding. I didn't necessarily start out as a voucher critic, to be honest with you. Some folks, maybe even in this room, sort of always understood from the beginning that this was bad news. It just wasn't the way I was wired. I was much more interested in, let's just see what this thing is doing. And I learned some really bad things about the way these programs were working. And so as far back as 11 years ago, I started writing a piece for the New Republic, a major magazine, as well as a bunch of academic articles about what we were seeing. But then I moved on to other questions. My first teaching job after graduate school was at the University of Kentucky. I didn't move here until I was tenured down at Kentucky, and then MSU allowed me the chance to come back to Michigan, which is hard to do sometimes in that field. You kind of have to go where the work is, and I got the chance to do it. But I was doing other things. I wasn't necessarily just interested in vouchers. I wanted to know, for example, how do we improve classrooms in rural Kentucky or rural districts all over the country, especially with respect to the teaching profession. Teaching was, and still is, a really important and well-respected job in some of the most rural and remote parts of our country. But how do we continue that? Those are the types of questions I was asking. So my point here is that I came to these types of questions doing a lot of other things. And that's important because, again, when I talk about choices, when I talk about whether we're talking about education in kids and families or whether we're talking about across the policy space, you got to think about all these things, whether it's vouchers, whether it's charter schools, whether it's teacher professional development. There's only one pot of money to go around. Unless, of course, you're a billionaire. All right, so I thought I was done with the conversation about vouchers. As I told you a second ago, this was like an early career thing for me. It just wasn't something that we had sort of moved on. I moved back to Michigan, we didn't have vouchers, we have charter schools, but it wasn't necessarily how I was setting myself out to do. I did not plan a life where I was going to go around the country and talk about these things. It's just not how it worked out. But over the last 3 years really, since the COVID-19 pandemic, vouchers have been spreading again all over the country. And my public role in this space, moving from kind of a data analyst and policy analyst to someone speaking in front of groups like yours and all over the country, speaking to legislatures, increasingly involved, to be honest with you, in the political process, that started for me with a call from NBC News about 3 years ago when Betsy DeVos was trying to push a new version of a voucher scheme here in this state. And NBC News, this was the national desk, said, what do you think about this? Why is this? And I honestly was sort of in disbelief. I hadn't been paying attention much at the time. I was kind of, why are we even having this conversation again? We know these things don't work. And I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. But it was since March of 2022, just over 3 years ago, that conversation was had. She didn't get that passed here at the time, maybe partly through some of the work you all were doing or others were doing, educating voters about it. But That was the start. And since then, there's been this big spread. I don't know if you can see this picture here, but hopefully you can at least see the direction, the shape. The shape means they've been growing. And then this is the map. Now all the little dots mean different types of voucher programs. The other side on this, we're in this big, long-standing argument, Betsy DeVos and me, about what to call these things. If it uses taxpayer dollars to fund private school tuition, it's a voucher. Period. And they've got a lot of fancy names for it. Hope scholarships, freedom accounts in some states, tax credits like the one Betty mentioned, I'll tell you more about in a few minutes. So there's different versions of doing this. All of them have in common we're using taxpayer dollars to fund private school tuition. And that's where this is the map we got today.
Now we have to add Texas to it.
Now we have to add Texas to it, where I just was, yeah. Okay. So what I have been doing, that's right, thank you for that. That's a really important oversight. But in any event, let's try to think positively for a second. Maybe we'll start to roll these back, I don't know. I have been in most of these places over the last year, but especially since January 1st. 23 state capitals. Partly testifying as an expert, and increasingly more in speaking out against this stuff. There's a difference. Town halls, legislative events, press conferences, rallies, things like that. They're all the same bill. And now they have a version in Congress. So I want to talk for a second about where these things come from before I really kind of jump into the guts of this stuff. The first voucher idea was formed by a conservative economist named Milton Friedman, writing in 1955. 6 months after a really important Supreme Court decision you may have heard of called Brown versus Board of Education. Now, Milton Friedman says he was not personally a segregationist. I don't actually, and there's a big debate right now because this guy is an idol on the right. You see guys, you've got posters of this man in their dorm rooms in college and things like this. This is a real idol on the right. So there is a debate about whether or not Milton Friedman was a segregationist. I don't actually have a lot of interest in that. What is not arguable is that a lot of segregationists sure liked his idea. And his editor at the time, and we now know this from the historical record, and I write about this in my book, his editor at the time of this essay said, you can't write this essay and not respond to what just happened in the Supreme Court. He was working on the essay before the court ruled. So in a series of footnotes, he explained, I'm not personally a segregationist, but he called forced integration, in his words, the lesser of two evils. If you had to choose between forced integration, as he called it, and forced segregation, he said he would personally choose forced integration. But why have the conversation at all? Why not just let parents have vouchers so they could choose where they sent their kids to school, public or private, regardless of what their personal opinion was. The courts and the government and history should stay out of the question about racial integration or any other form of integration, income, whatever. So that's kind of the origin story here, you guys. And this is how he resolved the puzzle for himself. He also, by the way, a few years later, made a name, when he became really famous, he made a name for himself advising foreign governments, including the Pinochet regime in Chile in the 1970s. The Pinochet regime in Chile had a voucher program designed in the image of sort of the way Milton Friedman talked about it. And conservative think tanks to this day, AI, Cato, Heritage, those guys that don't like me very much, still cite the Chilean voucher program as a model for how to do education policy and other types of policy as well. I don't know about all of you, but I decline the idea that an authoritarian regime in Chile is the right model for United States public policy. But differences of opinion, I suppose. All right. So who wants vouchers? Well, one thing we know is not voters. actual, honest to God voters. As recently as, so vouchers have actually never survived, not once, a statewide ballot initiative. Did you know that? There have been a couple charter schools initiatives that have won statewide support. Not very many, but there have been a couple. But vouchers, taxpayer-funded private tuition, have never won statewide support. When you put the question to actual voters. As recently as November, 3 states rejected vouchers. Colorado, Nebraska, and Kentucky. 2 of those 3 states went heavily for Donald Trump. In Nebraska, voters actually, 57% of voters voted against the voucher law that had just been put in place. And in Nebraska, voters, actually, there's a quirk in their constitution that allows you to pull back a law the legislature's just made. And they did, which is hard to do. You all probably know, right? It's not easy to just rescind anything. Nebraska went for Trump. In Kentucky, where I spent a couple of times, had the honor of speaking with Andy Beshear down there, Governor Beshear, introducing him at a press conference on this issue. 65% of voters voted against school vouchers on election day this past November, and 65% of voters voted for Donald Trump. All 120 counties in Kentucky voted against vouchers, 119 of those by double digits. So, I know Joanne over there, we talked about rural communities before I spoke. Rural voters in particular do not like this stuff for the simple reason that there ain't any private schools in rural communities. So if one way to think about the election was, well, maybe people didn't see how good economic news was necessarily translating to their kitchen tables and to their pocketbooks personally, one way to think about the voucher issue is along the same lines. They get all this rhetoric from Betsy DeVos, from the Heritage Foundation, from whoever, the Koch brothers. They don't necessarily, no matter whether they're Republican or Democrat, they don't necessarily see how this helps them in their lives. And when they get a chance to vote on that issue, they turn this stuff down. Well, who does want vouchers? I know I'm not asking you to read the fine print here on this one, but if you can read the 1 and the 2 and the 3, that's all I'm asking you to do today. This is the first page of the education chapter in Project 2025. The first page. The first paragraph says, let's eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. The second 2 paragraphs call for a national school voucher scheme. This thing it is on those 2 pieces, removing the U.S. Department of Education and a national system of school vouchers on which the entire sort of right-wing education agenda is built. So that's number 1. Well, if I weren't in Michigan, I would have to sort of talk about Michigan for a second. Everybody across the country knows who Betsy DeVos is. I don't have to tell you who Betsy DeVos is. But everywhere I go, Betsy DeVos is I think sometimes when we're in Michigan, she's been so influential here, we don't realize necessarily how influential she's been all over the country. I mean, it's almost been like a circus, a traveling circus, me and Betsy DeVos's lobbyists, every one of those state capitals. They register, right? I've had Republican lawmakers tell me, we're just trying to get something so these guys leave. But she's been very clear about what she's trying to do here and why. She says public schools have replaced churches as centers of community, and she wants voucher systems to come in and do the work to make churches centers of community again instead of public schools. This is partly why I started the presentation the way I did with a picture of myself standing out in front of my church when I was a kid. No one's attacking religion here. What we're saying, at least what I am saying, is that I don't think this is the right model for helping kids and families. Also, I would decline the idea that churches have just been totally replaced as centers of community. You drive down the street, for many of you are people of faith, work at churches too. Like, this is a very important role that churches still play in communities. But Betsy DeVos is not good enough for her. She wants the taxpayer dollars supporting those goals. And that's part of what we're talking about here. And we're starting to see it's not just in West Michigan. Arizona, for example, the most far along advanced of all the states that have had this so far. Billions and billions of dollars. This is not about parents. This is not about voters. This is about billionaires and what they're trying to do to remake American education and American policy and politics in the way they would like it to be. But it's not just Betsy DeVos. The Koch guys are at this too. Well, David Koch has passed on, but Charles Koch, his older brother, is still around, and he's got this vast network of supporters. In our state, the most relevant one is called the Americans for Prosperity. They do all the door knocking and the lip dropping you might see on election day. Done some battle with those guys too in other states. The Koch people don't care about church. They're not interested in where people go to the bathroom in public schools. They're not interested in banning books. They don't care about any of that stuff. They want vouchers because if Betsy DeVos sees public schools as displacing churches, the Koch people just see public schools as government. And they don't like government because they see government as the entity telling them they can't burn holes in the ozone layer or, pollute the Great Lakes with oil. So they don't like government. They see public schools as government. The through line between sort of the Betsy DeVos view of the world and the Charles Koch view of the world is also a very practical one that's deep hostility to labor unions, in particular to teachers' unions. So a lot of this comes down to one of the things I say in the book too. All the existential stuff aside, all the fancy words aside, all the Milton Friedman aside, some of this is just partisan politics, honestly. You have to think about this like a political campaign. That map I showed you is the battleground they're working on. All right, so I told you I've been all over the place. I won't bore you with more vacation pictures, but just some examples. Like I said, I've done some town halls. Yes, I know Randy Weingarten. This seems to be a thing that the guys show when they Josh Cowan. They'll show a picture of me with Randy, or Governor Beshear, or Governor Walz. When I was down in Kentucky talking about this issue before the election, I was going to a lot of churches. I was testifying in a lot of legislatures. This one's from Texas, where I spent an hour and a half alone in the well of the legislature with a bunch of these guys going at me. They had basically the book on me from the heritage folks and all this stuff. I think I did okay, to be honest with you. We didn't stop the bill from passing, but costing her a lot of money to try to push these things through. All right, so who else wants vouchers? Besides Betsy DeVos and Charles Koch and all that. The thing you need to know, if you take actually nothing else from this conversation today, is this, because you're going to start seeing this tax bill a lot in the news, Betty mentioned, it's that vouchers overwhelmingly fund kids who are already in private school. Yeah. I went to a couple years of private school, my parents sent me. They seem to think that's a gotcha for me too. Well, I sent all my kids to public school, but Josh's parents did. Well, hell, I would have gotten a voucher because I was already there. That's the people that these things help are the kids mostly already in private school. Roughly 3/4 of voucher users, state after state after state, already in private school to begin with. Now, are all those folks wealthy? No. But it is a subsidy for existing behavior. It is not about new choices for families. I could have picked 15 different headlines. I picked Politico and I picked the Wall Street Journal just to show you this isn't some left-wing union talking point. This is really well understood data for those of us in the sort of community of folks talking about this stuff. But even though over the last 18 years we've known that, over the last 3, this has become really a real handout for wealthy folks. Because in the old days, when I first started working on this stuff, vouchers were still means tested. So there was at least an income cap in how you could use them. Not anymore in most of these places. The average user in state after state after state of voucher systems, well higher income than non-voucher users in the same county. When we look at this in granular county level data. 1/4 of state vouchers in Florida, just as an example, go to the top 10% of earners in the state. That's really what we're talking about at the end of the day. It's just another way to fund wealthy choices. The other thing that's happening too is that states are starting to just dispense with the pretense that this is entirely about parents and starting to fund private schools and specifically religious schools directly. In Ohio, just over the border, not only do they have a crappy football team, but they're diverting taxpayer funds to building new religious schools to try to sweep away more and more kids from the public schools. This headline is not even a year old. I'm not here to shill for test scores and standardized tests, but standardized tests they are the coin in the realm, essentially. Public schools have to take them, and it's by test scores that public schools are often judged. So what I say is, and I got enough on my plate with these guys coming after me, DeVos and the Heritage people, I don't get into the test score fight, but what I do say is, if we're going to talk test scores, let's talk test scores. You know how voucher kids do on test scores? Really poorly. I mentioned that 3/4 of voucher users are already in private school to begin with. That means 1/4 or so transfer every year from public to private school. And for those kids, we actually know how they do. In the older programs where we actually used to ask the questions, they've stopped asking the question because they don't like the results. For kids who switch, we've seen some of the largest academic declines we've ever seen on any research question in the history of education. For kids who transfer from public to private school. How big? On par with what COVID-19 did to test scores more recently. And a few years back, what Hurricane Katrina did to the academic growth of kids who suffered through that natural disaster. So we're talking natural disaster bad here. How can that be, Josh? Aren't private schools these elite academies that are saving kids from desperately failing public schools? Turns out, no. There are amazing private schools out there. Real elite providers of education that's really hard to get into, cost 40 grand a year. Most private schools are not Detroit Country Day or Cranbrook in our state. Most of them are what I call subprime providers. They're usually financially distressed, often have enrollment to actually accept a child because there's not a lot of room, there's room there, and there's room there because not a lot of people want to go there. And often, increasingly, they don't care about academics at all. They're not teaching academics. You got schools in Florida now downplaying the role of slavery in American life, saying humans and dinosaurs live together. You got a whole bunch of schools teaching creationism. Listen, teach creationism. It's none of my business. Don't use taxpayer dollars for it. And don't use taxpayer dollars for it and tell me that public schools are failing on the same test scores. Talk to teach calculus when you're teaching creationism. That's what's going on. That's why the results are so bad. Okay, it's not actually magic. You had a counterpoint to me today from Mackinac or one of the others. They'd say, "Well, no, Josh, it's not that. It's government overregulation caused this." All right, I'll take that back. I know what's going on. I've been to a lot of these schools, and we've got good reporting to tell us what's going on. All right, the other thing that we can do, and then now I'm going to kind of pivot the conversation a little bit. I want to leave some room for questions and stuff. But so most voucher users are already in private school. Those who do switch suffer catastrophic academic results. And then the other thing, and this is the thing that I think increasingly we need to really be talking about. And this is the one that depending on the venue, honestly, I try to push more and more and more. So this is the thing that I really want to drill home. When it comes to vouchers, it's not school choice at all. It's the school's choice. Schools get to do the choosing. That legislation that Betty mentioned that I'm going to turn to in a second affirms the right of private schools to do whatever they want with their admissions policies and teach whatever they want. You know who gets left out when that happens? Students with special needs. Often in these religious schools, because the state of Arkansas is literally advertising private schools using its voucher program. Those private schools, some of them, investigative reporting down there shown have what they call sexual morality pledges parents have to sign. You know what that means? You can't be gay. You can't be divorced. Better not be a single mom. Or if you are, you better be celibate. Right? That's what we're talking about here. These private schools get to do that on the taxpayer dime. And by the way, they get to do that and their test scores are still bad. So, just want to say one more thing too. You all remember this guy. This has all been a long time coming. This is Kenneth J. Starr. Do you know what Ken Starr was doing moonlighting while he was impeaching Bill Clinton? 1998, 1999, he was also defending Wisconsin and Cleveland vouchers in federal court. This is Ken Starr steps to the Supreme Court in February of 2002 after the Supreme Court heard the Zellman versus Simmons-Harris case, which was the first federal approval of a voucher system. So when I said some of this just comes down to right-wing politics and a partisan campaign politics, this is part of what I'm talking about. All right? And you don't have to be like a conspiracy theorist. This is just the reality of the facts. All right. So now where are we? Well, Betty told us already. We didn't plan it this way, by the way. You guys, I think this kind invitation was like 9 months ago or something. And I held the date. But that's how prevalent actually this stuff is. That 9 months ago, we were having this conversation, I think it was even before this book came out, and here we are talking about the same stuff. This week, this would force vouchers into Michigan and every other state. Because it's using taxpayer dollars at the federal level, not the state level, where we still have a ban against this. One of the things I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes before we do the Q&A is just sort of talk to you about this in the context of everything else that's happening. So while this is happening, feds are pulling back housing vouchers, almost the exact same policy vehicle for low-income families, just as one example. I don't know how you do that. You write a bill to say you get vouchers for tuition if you're already in private school, but if you're applying for a housing voucher because you have low income, you're out of luck. Or you're more likely to be out of luck. But that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about ending the U.S. Department of Education, the most important body in the United States. You know what the Department of Education does at the end of the day? It's the most important legal entity that makes sure that discrimination isn't happening in public schools. And if it's happening, because it does happen, public schools reflect society, that there's someone held responsible. That's really what a lot of this is about. They're moving student loan repayments, special needs oversight to RFK Jr. and the Department of Health and Human Services. That guy was swimming in Rock Creek Park the other day. If you haven't been to Rock Creek Park, it's full of shit. I'm sorry to swear, but it's literally full of it. That guy was swimming in it. I don't want him anywhere near my kids' health, much less my kids' special needs plan for a school. But that's what the plan is. And it's affecting us here at home. Okay, federal dollars being lost or being threatened. We have to pass the bills. They haven't passed the bills yet, but that's the plan. Cuts to public schools, cuts to housing, cuts to community development, and a lot more. You've probably heard about Medicaid. Incredibly vital source of health care for millions of people. Republicans talk about this as if it's all the lower income folks, as if there's something wrong with that. But it's actually a bedrock of healthcare provisions for the American middle class at this point too. 9 million folks will get left out of Medicaid according to nonpartisan analyses of these bills, including 700,000 here in Michigan. And they ended up not going ahead with cutting Head Start, the long-time plan for a program for a lower income preschool. They're not doing that this year, as it turns out. But I'm still going to tell you about it because they're going to try next year. I mean, this is a long-term, a conservative, right-wing plan for preschool and childcare is more parents in home. And we all know what they mean by parents, don't we? They're getting rid of Head Start because they want more women at home. They also have this weird, I don't have a slide on it, they also have this weird thing about increasing the birth rate.
It's so crazy.
I know. But this is what we're talking about here. All right, so this federal thing, let me just tell you how this works. And I explained it in the Free Press article that Betty was so kind enough to print out for you, but let me just sort of summarize if you haven't had a chance to look at it. $5 billion in year one, that's, I don't know if that sounds like a lot of money. It's not a huge amount of money when it comes to the federal budget, but it's a lot of money when it comes to education. Does that make sense? It could be up to $500 million per state, so we could have $500 million as recent as probably next fall, but it could, if they get their votes together, be as early as this fall, because tax policy works really fast. And then the cap would blow off this thing within 3 years. The way it works is Betsy DeVos, Charles Koch, Jeff Yass, Elon Musk, whoever, can donate up to $5,000 or 10% of your actual income. So it would be a lot more if you're Betsy DeVos. $12 million is one estimate I saw. Instead of what you owe in federal taxes, you pay it to a voucher middleman called, very pleasantly, a scholarship granting organization that then pays out vouchers in local communities. There are scholarship granting organizations here in East Lansing, all over this region, but they're privately funded. They could now start to receive donations from Betsy DeVos or whoever, who then gets a federal tax credit. So it's paid for that way, through federal taxes. States like ours, prohibited from making sure those schools are available to everyone, can't. The code is very clear, states cannot get in the way of this. And if you do have a voucher system already, we don't, so this would push vouchers into Michigan, but in Texas or wherever, you just get to top the vouchers up. Estimates vary, but it's about 10,000 or so they think could go to each for each kid with each voucher. Oh, and then one last thing. You'll hear the rhetoric about this thing as an anti-poverty program. Eligibility for this in year one is up to 300% of local income. Here in mid-Michigan, that's up to about nearly $300,000 per family of eligibility for this program. Now that's not necessarily vast wealth, but it's not a low-income targeted program. And remember, most voucher users are already private school to begin with, so this is just a payout for them, for the most part. Remember when I talked about choices? All of this is coming at a cost of something else. So, while we're talking about basically handouts to existing private school kids, nothing wrong with those kiddos, but just they're already in private school. While we're talking about, do you know there's roughly 40 private schools in Michigan's 7th congressional district, where we're located right now? There's not very many. Most of them are in Livingston County. There's about one private school for every 4,000 K-12 students here in this region. So we're talking about a lot of money, but not helping a lot of people at a cost to this other stuff. 200,000 plus folks on Medicaid or Medicaid expansion. 153,000 folks using Social Security. 137,000 or so K-12 public school kids. More than $200 million each year in federal funding to schools in this district. 24 million, I mentioned Head Start, 24 million for Head Start. 6,000 federal jobs. We have a lot of federal jobs in this district, in this region. Our region, you probably all know what the 7th is, but this whole yellow region. All of Livingston, all of Ingham, all of Shiawassee, all of Clinton, most of Eaton, big region. Those are kids and families, those are people's lives we're talking about. And here at home, 12,000 MSU jobs. You know, one of the things they say about me, they seem to think professor is a dirty word. J.D. Vance says professors are the enemy. He literally said that. You know, fine. There's a lot more than professors at MSU, right? We're talking about groundskeepers, we're talking about custodians, we're talking about pipe fitters, we're talking about nurses, we're talking about lawyers, we're talking about doctors. We're talking about a lot of people's lives here. And they're just, cutting hundreds of millions of dollars from the institutions that keep us afloat in this region. For what? Because they're making the choice to do things like fund tuition for kids already in private school and tax cuts for billionaires. It's that simple. So, just checking the time here. I'm wrapping up, I promise. So the thing that I want to tell you though is everywhere I go, I've talked a lot about the stuff I just said, especially the voucher side of it, for a couple of years now. And the thing I keep getting as a question in response, from whether it's a group like yours, or a legislator in testimony, or a reporter for whatever, well, what do you want, Colin? Like, at least the other side, say what you will about vouchers, but at least they have a plan. I answer that question, I take it seriously. I mean, it's an important thing to talk about. I wish we were in a space where you didn't have to you could just say this thing is wrong and it hurts families without having someone come back at you and say, well, what do you want to do? But I take it seriously, it's an important question. So I ask two things. So what works? That's the policy analyst piece of me. What works? And then increasingly, in this political environment, as a man, as a person, what's the right thing to do? I'm not willing to cede the language of right and wrong to these people. So, this is just a short list. It starts with funding public schools. It's just, you gotta spend more money. You've gotta put your money where your mouth is. You get what you pay for. I told you I was a Christian man. The Bible's version of saying this is where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You gotta start by funding public schools. But okay, once we're doing that, what else? Well, how about new investments in the teacher pipeline? How about new investments in grow your own programs, which are starting to work in communities that may, like in Appalachian, Kentucky, that may not have access to a big regional university like this one, big national university like this one, but maybe have people who really do want to work with students in their community. These grow your own programs have started to work. Just regular professional development and in-service training. Supports like high-dose tutoring. Improving how we teach literacy, how we teach STEM in the classroom. And also, I don't shy away from workforce language, by the way, even as an educator. I think it's okay to say public schools provide strong economic opportunity too, by the way. A lot more economic opportunity than giving tax cuts to billionaires anyway. Universal pre-K, universal school school meals, not school vouchers. Did you know? How many of you guys are former teachers or holy crap? First of all, bless you for your work. But second, listen, I don't need to tell you. So universal school meals not only reduce the stigma of poverty for kids, but if we're talking test scores, as it turns out, universal school meals actually improve academic outcomes. Because I don't have to tell you that hungry kids can't learn or have a hard time learning in the classroom. So if we're talking about failing reading rates and all this business, school meals helps that actually. Updates to HVAC and infrastructure improvements in classrooms. Because if hungry kids can't learn, kids who are struggling to breathe because it's too hot in the summer or too cold in the winter, or because they have asthma, or because we're just coming out of a once-in-a-generation pandemic, or because some jerk poisoned the water in Flint, Michigan and they can't drink out of the drinking fountain, they have a hard time learning too. So let's make sure that they go to school in a safe place. It's not only the right thing to do, but it will actually improve learning. And then when they're done in K-12, let's make sure they can go do what they want to do. Let's invest in career and technical ed. Let's invest more in college access and so much more. But I also just want to point out one more time that what's being cut we also know works. The list I just showed you was my list of stuff we can keep doing into the future, but the stuff that's at stake, whether it's Medicaid, which also, by the way, improves academic outcomes, Head Start, investments in public ed, child tax credits, research and development, war on cancer, and so much more. These things work too, and they're at stake as well. So it's also okay to stand up for stuff that's already here and we know working and say you cannot cut it. It's the wrong thing to do. So I just want to wrap up and then I'll take a few questions. Everywhere I go, I see you all with these democracy badges, these Defend Democracy badges, and I got one too now I'm going to probably wear. I get a lot of questions about democracy wherever I go, partly because I go down to the South sometimes, it doesn't always feel like democracy down there, if I'm honest with you. But also because when you speak about public education, you know, there's this belief, and I have it, that public education is central to democracy. But when I talk to moms and dads, parents, reporters, stakeholder groups, and communities, they don't always talk about democracy, or when they do, they talk about it in words that, you know, aren't necessarily ones we might use in this exact room. And I just want to highlight that because, you know, I think there's this false choice. There's a big narrative right now that you got to talk about the price of eggs, or you got to talk about democracy, or you got to talk about what's at stake with our republic and with voting, or you got to talk about the economy or whatever. And I say, I don't think, I've never met of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people I have met since January 1st alone, I don't think that that's a choice we have to make. We can talk about both. Maybe democracy is, for a single mom, is just having a public school system that's responsive to her kid who might need a little help learning to read. Maybe democracy for a young man with type 1 diabetes is just having a healthcare plan that's not going to throw him off for that pre-existing condition. Maybe democracy is just having the Social Security Agency call you back when you're trying to figure out where that check went. Maybe if you've lost your job, democracy is just a little bit of unemployment insurance to tide you over till you get back on your feet. Or if you have a job, having enough money set aside, not just to put food on the table, not just to survive, but to thrive and invest in your children's futures. A democracy that works for everyone is an economy that works for everyone, and an economy that works for everyone is a democracy that works for everyone. I really, really appreciate your time today, and I'm happy to take some questions. So the question was, how influential is Hillsdale? They play a big role in all this. They are big on pushing something called a classical Christian academy, which is basically, it sounds a lot smarter than it is. There's this sense on the American right that if you just put a picture of Homer or Plato or Socrates or Ben Franklin, you're somehow improving the kid's education in and of itself. So that's part of the Hillsdale curriculum. They're very influential, and they tie into the voucher space in the following way. They want that curriculum taught in a lot of schools. Do you guys all know? I know you do, but I'm going to ask anyway. You all know who Pete Hegseth is? Well, before Pete Hegseth became Defense Secretary, while he was still a weekend Fox News anchor, he wrote a book called The Battle for the American Mind, published 3 years ago, with some guy, I don't know his name. It's co-authored by someone who styles himself a classical Christian education proponent or something. He uses the Hillsdale model. In that book, which I have read so you don't have to, Hegseth explicitly and repeatedly in that book calls for school vouchers as fundamental to that battle for the American mind, and he wants those vouchers to fund Christian and classical education schools all over the country. In his view, hopefully within 20 years, the vast majority of American children going to school in those Christian classical education schools designed by Hillsdale and funded by you and me and our families through taxpayer dollars. So that's where they fit into it. Yeah.
All right, the end game.
Yeah.
Okay. So you put a generation of young people through this abomination, I'll call it. All right. What is that going to do to the competitiveness of the United States? To the rest of it, I mean, the jobs, the good jobs out there, all right, are technical.
Yeah.
All right. If you have nobody in the field, you're going to. I mean, it makes no sense.
Well, 150% tariffs don't make any sense either.
Well, I understand that, but I mean, it's like,
I hear you, but I mean, like, a lot of this doesn't make sense unless your end game really isn't about improving the lives of working families all over the
I
country
know.
through competitiveness, but it's also just,
well, what I'm saying, eventually this whole thing's gonna collapse
Sure.
on the economic and political, class.
But if you're Charles Koch and your main plan is making money, and you're Betsy DeVos and your main plan is making sure public schools are dismantled, and you've got lots and lots of money you inherited from your family,
Right.
I mean, maybe it's not such a concern for
But
them.
eventually it's gonna start to erode because you have to employ personnel to manage that, pool of money. Basically, I mean, it's like,
It's,
I mean,
it's at the end of the day, at least in the education space, what they really want is they want no. I mean, Philip Friedman would tell you want to know public funding for
slavery is
schools
what
at
they
all.
want, economic slavery.
The prosperity of the American worker, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness is not a top tier priority for these people.
It ain't a priority at all.
So, yeah, Abby, back to you.
I'm trying to put some puzzle pieces together.
Yeah.
Somewhere in your talk, you mentioned that they didn't do away with Head Start this year, but they're gonna come forward again. I think you mentioned this fall is sort of a timeline. I know that in Michigan, our House Republicans are currently holding our school budgets hostage. Does that relate?
It's a good question. It's where's the state budget process here that's held up for schools related to the federal budget? Officially, there are independent processes. I do think that some of the issues going on in the state budget here are specific to some of the long-standing back and forths in Lansing. To be honest with you, both parties have had some. They're not the same. That's not what I'm suggesting. But there's a lot of like inter-party back and forth on that issue. It's 100% true that Republicans in this state legislature are all on board with the privatization scheme. I mean, they were 4 years ago when they tried to push the state version of this federal tax credit through, and Whitmer vetoed it. So there's a little bit of that going on. I would just say there are still lawmakers on both sides of the aisle in Lansing that do want to continue to fund public schools. The question is how much and to what extent and whether it's enough. There's this myth out there that that just because we spend more and more a little bit each year in public schools, we're somehow throwing money at a bad problem. There's a lot of other things that need to happen to improve education in this state. Money is the start of the conversation, but it's not the end of the conversation. I do think that House Republicans here are probably waiting a little bit to see how the feds land, but I don't want to say to be fair to them, all lawmakers are wondering what's going to happen because so much of the state budget is built around this assumption that we're going to get, I mean, Medicaid alone, we're going to get $1 billion shortfall if the changes in Medicaid are made. So I think there's a little bit of trying to just figure that space out, and then the resources are going to get even more scarce. Yeah.
Is there anything we can do at this point? Is it a done deal? I mean, we could call our congressman, but
Yeah, I don't know what I'm allowed to say in this group, given your tax status. Calling Congress.
The local league is a C4.
Okay, well, calling Tom Barrett's the first thing you should do.
Call them every day.
Call him every day. You know, there's a lot of stuff to call about right now, right? I think it matters. I know it matters, actually. I know that phone calls affect these folks and make it difficult for them to go along with what their party wants them to do. I would also say talk to the Democrats, though, too, and make sure that standing up for these things is more than just a slogan. I think it is, but, you know, priorities, you know, there's always one pot of money to go around, whether it's in the state or in Congress. And it does mean that, you know, like organizations like yours, organizations like, frankly, the teacher groups, school leaders groups, they're pretty good about talking about the importance of public education. What I tried to do today is talk about a little bit about how it all fits together a little bit. And so whatever is your passion too, whether it's, you know, get, you know, one of the Democrats on the phone and say, you know, make a floor speech about this. I want to see that thing on Instagram. or call Barrett's office again. Call them whenever you're able to use your time up, and remind them that maybe one private school for every 4,000 kids here isn't such a good use of money. They are going to have to make cuts to get this thing through the Senate. I mean, the whole tax bill, but even this voucher thing. I'm a little worried about the voucher thing specifically because most of the other pieces of legislation in that big tax bill don't have Betsy DeVos camped out on Capitol Hill pushing for it. And she is. I mean, within a week after the election, she was there taking selfies with all of these members who are going to vote in Ways and Means. So when you have a billionaire who's literally willing to just hold your feet to the fire on this thing, it's hard to do. But I would say calling your members really does matter. I've seen it work on the voucher issue, and I've seen it work in state after state after state. It's why it took 3 legislative sessions for Betsy. She did get it through, but it's why it took 3 legislative sessions in, for example, Texas. Because Republicans in that state were the ones who actually said, you know what, and they were rural Republicans. I don't think that the Michigan 7 quite counts as a rural district per se, but it ain't, Bloomfield Hills either, where there's a bunch of schools. We got 40 schools, most of them are in Livingston. I'm going to be at Livingston County Dems Thursday night talking about this issue, so I'm not crapping on Livingston here. I'm just saying, it is not something that's going to help most kids and families in our district, and I do think that reminding folks to strip away the rhetoric about it, nothing that I just set up here. I mean, I have been grateful that my voice has really added a lot of numbers and context to this debate, but none of what I just said is secret anymore. Like, we all know this stuff. There's a big story that's going to be coming out in NPR this week, a multi-part series. It's going to make a lot of the same points here. I've been helping them with it. So I think providing the information helps, letting them know that it's not providing opportunity for folks. It's really just a new subsidy for existing people.
Can it be bought legally?
What's that?
Legally, can it be bought the way it's written?
So I have spent the last 9 months at a group called the Education Law Center, just working in this space and trying to do a little bit of brushing up on my own skills in legal space. And the answer is I don't know. I'm not an attorney, but I don't want to speak for that organization since my time with them is now past. But there's a lot that can be litigated. One thing I didn't mention, and I know we really are on time, and I'm happy to stay after for individuals. One thing I didn't mention is on this issue, on the legal issue, the Supreme Court is about to rule on the potential for religious public schools. There's a case coming out called St. Isidore, coming out of Oklahoma, that would allow the nation's first Catholic charter school. Charter schools are public schools. Now, whether that would ram Catholic charter schools or other types of religious charter schools into our state is maybe a little bit still an open question, and will depend on what the Supreme Court rules. If they just say, if you've got certain providers like you do in Oklahoma, you can't kick religious schools out, then maybe it doesn't bring religious charters here. But if they just widely say, if you've got charter schools, you got to have religious charter schools, which some people say they will, then we would have religious charter schools here as soon as this fall as well. So that's a tough one.
So as an evaluator of charter schools, the largest charter school management company is National Heritage Academy. It's by far has more children than almost all the other groups combined. So do you see them as perhaps sneaking from being a public choice charter school into
It's interesting you ask. So
school, a religious
the
school?
official position of the National Charter School lobby groups is that they are opposed to the religious charter. They actually filed on the same side as Americans United for Church and State, weirdly enough, because their view is they are public charter schools and they're public schools. But if the change happens, then they'll just jump into them. Michigan has by far the largest for-profit charters sector in the country. Not all charter schools are designed as poorly as they are in Michigan. I was on a panel. I don't know, a year ago or something, and there was a pro-voucher lobby guy, and there was a charter school lobby guy, and I said something to the effect of what I just said, that not all charter schools are done as poorly, because there are some charter schools that are run by museums and libraries, and in other states that actually work pretty well for kids. And this guy says, he goes, "Oh yeah, no, we stay away from Michigan. We don't even touch those guys." And what he meant by that is when they go out there to Congress to make a case for charter school funding, they just stay away from Michigan because it's such a bad. example that they don't want any part of that. So, you know, this is, I call charter schools in Michigan Betsy Boston's consolation prize. She hasn't been able to get vouchers here so far, but all of this is stuff we're going to see, certainly. And by the way, if this tax credit voucher scheme passes, then you will see National Heritage Academies and other organizations just opening voucher funds, because they get to skim 10% off the top of these things and call it overhead. So for every voucher they give out, they get to keep 10% of it themselves, and it's not technically profit because they have to be a C3 to distribute these dollars, but they get to keep it. So you will see an NHA, they'll create a scholarship fund of some sort, and then they'll retain 10% to keep themselves going.
I think we'll take one more question.
One more, then I'll hang out for a little bit
But if Josh
after.
is willing to stay and you continue,
Yeah.
I have a whole long list.
Sure.
Go ahead.
With regard to the vouchers, it's my understanding that they don't cover the entire amount.
Usually, yeah.
So if you have to have money to even use the voucher
Right.
to fill that gap.
Right. So this is one of the reasons that you find this fact that most voucher users are already in private school to begin with. And not only does the voucher not always cover tuition, especially in the few high-end voucher schools that participate, you started to see in the states that have passed this, those private schools just go ahead and raise tuition once the voucher bill passes. So, as an example, in Iowa, where they've now 2 years in, Betsy DeVos in particular, she's very close to the governor of Iowa, Kim Reynolds right now, made it a personal priority. They did a lot of appearances there. She doesn't appear much in Michigan so much anymore. She's very active. There's a story just Detroit News today about it. But she is she does appear publicly in other states. And Iowa was one. And they did the law in the first couple of years so that voucher schools got full reimbursement for, I want to say K2, or early kindergarten through maybe second or third grade. And then they tapered it off for older grades for the short term, just to honestly afford it at the state level. And what you saw, and the reason we can know that it was the vouchers themselves that caused the private school tuition to jump, was the schools only raised tuition for the kids where the grades were paying the schools the full tuition, the full voucher amount. And they kept tuition flat for the schools that weren't serving grades the voucher was funding, essentially. And, you know, to be fair to the schools, I guess, I mean, we're talking about 30% tuition increases between years too, by the way, not like 5% or something. The other side on this issue, is in Iowa talking about this in the fall, the Reynolds press office was like, well, it's just inflation. It's not inflation. Very selected inflation, right? Somehow inflation figured out where the vouchers were going to be spending.
They don't know the difference.
But to be fair to the private schools in a weird way, they're only doing what policymakers incentivize them to do. So just going all the way back to the beginning of my conversation, right? Like, it was the legislature that did it, that told private schools you can do this. I don't want to, listen, I turned 47 in a couple months. I don't want to sit here and stand up in front of you and say, oh, in the old days. But in the old days, at least the voucher program, in the stuff where I started working on, the legislators were forced private schools to keep their tuition flat. So like, they all knew this was a problem and a possibility, and they really did care in the early days, or at least they tried to care about some of the kids in Milwaukee and in Cleveland and some of the places this stuff started on something of a bipartisan basis. Now, all bets are off now at this point. They don't care about that. If you think about that slide I showed you about the legislature in Ohio sending dollars to the private schools for construction, if you think about vouchers really as just a subsidy for those private schools too, then the tuition hikes make a lot of sense. It's just another way to funnel. There was a really famous study out of Notre Dame, actually, of all places, that showed that when vouchers come to town, they become the dominant source of revenue for churches. Because what the churches learn to do is they set up private schools, they take the dollars, and then they run at a cost lower than what the voucher's paying, and then they receive revenue. Good way for me to end, at least in front of you all. I mean, I go back to this. This isn't beating up on religion. This isn't beating up on the Catholic Church even. This isn't beating up on the personal values and priorities of individual families. What it is saying is that we have a limited amount of resources to spend on working families and kids across the country, and we need to do it in a way that works for everyone. So, I appreciate it.